welcomes you to Craig's Lawyers Lounge.
Oh, this is a place where prominent attorneys come to relax and talk about their life in the law and current events. And boy, do we have a distinguished guest right now. His name is William A. Jacobson. He's a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic, affiliated with Cornell. I do believe he's on the Cornell Law faculty. He had a distinguished career as a securities lawyer. A lot of us know him from his outstanding blog called legalinsurrection.com. William Jacobson, welcome to Craig's Lawyers Lounge.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I always offer a beverage or anything you might desire. We have a team of paralegals standing by. What can we get you?
I think I'll pass for now.
Not even a cup of coffee?
Well, I've had a lot of coffee today, so.
How much is a lot of coffee for you?
Several cups.
Several cups, same as me.
Yeah.
Tell us about your background. I noticed you went to Hamilton College.
Yep, I went to Hamilton College in upstate New York.
Do you know the connection of Hamilton College to Colorado?
No, I don't.
Well, there was a kid at Hamilton College who protested the visit of his Colorado University professor named Ward Churchill. And he was the one who discovered Churchill's post-9/11 column about chickens coming home to roost. And that whole Ward Churchill controversy started with an alert student body president at Hamilton College.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Well, the Hamilton I went to was very different than the one in the 90s or the one today. When I went there, it was a small, all-male school with a sister school called Kirkland College. And Kirkland was very liberal and Hamilton was kind of conservative. And eventually Hamilton absorbed Kirkland because it went out of business. But the Kirkland faculty took over, essentially, the Hamilton faculty over a decade or two. And that's why you had the Ward Churchill, the various left-wing faculty who were holdovers from the Kirkland days essentially started hiring their own people, and the faculty completely moved in a different direction, and that's why you had that whole controversy.
When I think about liberal places of higher education, I think about Ithaca, New York, and Cornell and the Ivy League. And that's where you went to law school, and you're a conservative. Tell us about your experience at Cornell.
Yeah, actually, I went to Harvard Law School, not to Cornell Law School.
Oh, I apologize.
I teach at Cornell now, and Harvard was the same way. It was very left-leaning. I was there a few years before Obama was there, so didn't run into him. But Eric Holder was there around the time I was there. Elena Kagan was there, and our infamous ex-governor, Eliot Spitzer, was a classmate of mine. So I was very used to that. And then Cornell is actually... I joined Cornell law faculty in the fall of 2007 after having been in private practice, and it's actually a fairly moderate place. I mean, obviously it's liberal-leaning, as most universities are, but it's not a crazy place like a Columbia or someplace like that where it's just completely ideological. So I think Cornell's a little bit different than a lot of the perceptions.
Well, that's good to know. My sister went to veterinary school at Cornell. Although I never visited her there, I just have heard stories about Ithaca, New York, and it's good to talk to somebody who actually knows it better. Do you live in Ithaca or around there?
We live in Ithaca. We used to split the year between Ithaca and Rhode Island, where we're originally from, or I should say for the last 20-plus years we're from. But now we're in Ithaca full-time, and I think you're right. The city of Ithaca, the population, is a lot more radical than the university, and that's unusual that you have that situation. Usually it's the reverse. But Ithaca is definitely a town where you have a lot of graying hippies who, still live that alternative lifestyle or push those alternative politics. So I'd say Ithaca is a lot more radical than Cornell is, believe it or not.
William A. Jacobson, our special guest, I forgot that you went to Harvard Law School, and it's amazing the people you get to know there. I had the privilege of once doing an event at the Paramount with Alan Dershowitz, where I got to do all the questioning and he did all the answering. And the people he's seen come through Harvard Law School is just amazing, including people like you, Barack Obama, and Ted Cruz. A lot of people dismiss Ted Cruz, but everybody, even people on the left, acknowledge this was one of the smartest guys who ever came through Harvard Law School. What can you tell us about Ted Cruz?
Well, I didn't know him, of course, but he is very brilliant. I think Alan Dershowitz has described him that way. And I think when you're going to be political at a place like Harvard Law School, you have to be better than everybody else if you're a conservative. You have to be smarter. You have to be more well-read. You have to be better prepared because it's you against a lot of people. And certainly he wouldn't have been the only conservative at Harvard Law School, but he would have been in a severe minority. And when you're in that situation, you have to be better. And that's what I see with a lot of politically active conservative students on campuses. They have to do better than the opposition because they are in a minority position. And that's why it's not surprising that Ted Cruz, whether it was at Princeton or later at Harvard, really excelled and because he had to sharpen his skills because he's basically arguing with everybody or almost everybody. Whereas if you're in a liberal position at a school, most people agree with you. You don't have to sharpen your skills and you don't get tested the way you do if you're a conservative.
I went to the Harvard of the West, the University of Colorado School of Law in Boulder, and it's interesting when you're in classes like constitutional law and you get called on by a professor, everybody kind of sizes you up. Well, is this guy conservative, liberal? I mean, it starts in law school. Were you as conservative back at Harvard Law as you are now?
No. Actually, I would say that at Harvard was my transformation, that I actually, when I was at Hamilton, supported Jimmy Carter. My first political endeavor when I was in my earliest of teens, maybe 10, 11, was on behalf of George McGovern. And I think I had a transformation in many ways at Harvard Law School because I began to see a form of liberalism that was a lot more aggressive and a lot nastier and a lot more bullying than I had ever experienced. And I also ran into what we're seeing a lot of now today, although it was smaller back then, a lot of the anti-Israel leftism on the campus. And so by the time I left Harvard Law School in 1984, I was a Reagan conservative. When I entered, I was a Carter Democrat. So I'd say Harvard for me was very transformative, but perhaps not in the way anybody would have expected.
I think it's appropriate for us to talk about Israel. In fact, in Denver, we're celebrating Israel's birthday tomorrow with a walk that begins at 10 a.m. at the Jewish Community Center. And there are a lot of great supporters of Israel in Colorado and in Denver, and I hope to see everybody out at that walk tomorrow. But what is going on with Israel on college campuses, this boycott, divestiture, sanctions movement? You've written a lot about it. You're passionate against it. Tell everybody what's going on.
Sure. There is a movement. They call themselves Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, BDS. It's really a charade. It's a facade for anti-Israelism. What it was, and few people know this history, at the 2001 Durban UN conference, which was so anti-Semitic the U.S. actually walked out on it.
Right, and it happened right before 9/11. I remember that.
That is where they formed the idea for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It was at the non-governmental organization forum where they issued the call for the international boycott. And that was the one, there was a late congressman, I'm just blanking out on his name right now, who attended, who himself was a Holocaust survivor and wrote
Tom Lantos?
Yes, Lantos, I'm sorry.
Right.
That's right. Late Congressman Lantos, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he attended that, and he wrote extensively about what was going on and the horrendous, outwardly anti-Semitic, not something where there's a gray area, just, caricatures of Jews, all sorts of horrible things passed around. That is the meeting where they issued the BDS boycott call. Most people don't know that. What they then did is they built a facade, and the facade was that it would be a call from Palestinian civil society. And that call came in 2004 and then again in 2005. So what these people say is we're not anti-Semitic, we're not actually even anti-Israel, we're just responding to a call from Palestinian civil society. That was a setup. That is what at the Durban conference they said how they would do it. And that is a call for a complete academic, cultural, and economic boycott of Israel until Israel ceases occupation of all Palestinian lands. And that's very key. They use that terminology because it allows, liberals on U.S. campuses to say, oh, well, they only want Israel to leave the West Bank. No, they're very specific, but it also allows other people to say they consider Tel Aviv occupied territory. So these are very cunning people. And what has happened, it took a few years, but over time they have organized on a lot of college campuses, calling Israel an apartheid state, which is false, calling Israel committing genocide, which is absurd. I mean, the Palestinian population has increased manyfold. There's no genocide going on. All sorts of false accusations, and we're dealing with people who really are just outright liars. And I say that all the time because that's what they are. And they just make stuff up. They twist facts. They ignore facts. You'll hear them go on and on about the so-called, they call it the apartheid wall Israel built in the West Bank. Israelis call it the security barrier. What you will never hear them say, even once, is when and why it was built. It was built after the Second Intifada, when Yasser Arafat walked away from the Camp David peace agreements and said, we're going to attack Israelis. And in 2002, 452 Israeli civilians were killed in suicide bombing and other terrorist attacks. That's when Israel decided to build the barrier. But these people make it sound like Israel just woke up one day and decided we're going to make life tough for the Palestinians and we're just going to build a wall for the hell of it. And that's not the history. So you have people who have no compunctions about lying and distorting history. But you know what? They've been repeating it for 10 years, almost unopposed on college campuses and in the media, and particularly in Europe. And they've gained a little bit of traction. Now, I don't want to overstate it and be, a fearmonger. Their traction is mostly on I shouldn't say handful, about 2 to 3 dozen campuses around the country, including many in the University of California system.
Mm-hmm.
University of California system is probably the worst for all of this stuff. And what they do is they hold their Israeli apartheid weeks, and they try to get student governments to pass resolutions calling for divestment from Israel. I mean, the good news is that most of those fail. The other good news is that the student government has no power to do anything. So none of those have ever been implemented. But what you have is you have a decade-long propaganda campaign against Israel on college campuses. And while it hasn't paid off in terms of divestment from Israel or pulling funds from Israel, what it is doing is it's creating a percentage of the younger generation who have this completely warped view of Israel and warped view of the conflict. Those people end up working at newspapers, end up working at at government agencies, et cetera. So while it hasn't been successful in terms of actual results, it is a fairly malicious movement that is poisoning a lot of minds against Israel, and it's something that needs to be fought.
Well, I think they're easily satisfied. If only the Jews, 6 million strong, would go into the Mediterranean and start swimming back to Europe, I think they would be satisfied. And it is difficult for Jewish kids on college campuses, especially in the University of California system, but they have big-time supporters like Jimmy Carter, who you confessed you once backed. I had occasion to cross-examine him on the radio, and I got him to, challenge me on Ismail Haniyeh going to Tehran and talking about what should happen to Israel. He contested me, and that became part of a bunch of people at the Carter Center leaving their position, if you remember that. The other thing that concerns me is, of course, Barack Obama, but this week, Pope Francis recognizing a Palestinian state that's dominated by a terrorist organization. What do you think of what Pope Francis is doing?
Well, I think it's part of a greater trend, which is to take the path of least resistance, to try to recognize a Palestinian state when it doesn't really have any of the attributes that we normally associate with the state. But that, to me, is somewhat of a side issue. I mean, I think the real issue is that the West has essentially capitulated to a view that Israel is the problem. And forget you have, 70 years, almost 70 years of rejectionism from the Arabs. You have Abbas, who wrote his PhD on Holocaust denial,
right.
That the Holocaust never really happened. You have really inflammatory rhetoric on Palestinian media. There's a great outfit, Palestinian Media Watch, which grabs these things. I mean, really off the charts sort of anti-Semitic stuff. You have, of course, Hamas controlling Gaza, but the problem is the Palestinians have not, I think, truly accepted the notion of a majority Jewish state in the region. And if you remember when there were the so-called peace talks with John Kerry a couple of years ago, Bibi Netanyahu said that one of the conditions that we want for a final agreement is that you recognize Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, not exclusively a Jewish state, but as the homeland of the Jewish people, and we will recognize the entity to be created in the West Bank and Gaza as the homeland of the Palestinian people. And they would not do it. That was a red line they would not cross, because in their hearts they do not accept they truly do not accept the existence of a majority Jewish state in the Middle East, and that's the heart of the problem. Right. And until that changes, where you draw the lines on a map aren't going to make a difference. And Israel is not going to commit suicide. No other country in the world has ever asked to commit suicide. If Israel were to leave the West Bank the way it left Gaza in 2005, within a week you would have Hamas in control. Mahmoud Abbas would probably be assassinated or flee the country by Hamas. You would have another Iranian missile base, not 50 miles from Tel Aviv, but 7 or 8 miles from Tel Aviv. No country in the world is expected to commit suicide, except the West expects Israel to commit suicide, and it's not going to do that. And what will change that equation is the day the Palestinian people and their leaders acknowledge not just that there will be this entity called Israel, but that it is the homeland of the Jewish people. Right. And that recognition has to be reciprocal.
Right. And that is the problem with the Iran deal. The puppet masters in Tehran. I had the privilege of being in the House chambers when Benjamin Netanyahu talked about Iran. It's a jihadi government. It's a theocracy. And I don't understand. I mean, one of the conditions that a lot of us have been insisting on is Tehran should recognize the right of Israel to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people. But they won't do it, but Barack Obama doesn't seem to care.
No, one thing that I noticed, and I obviously have been covering this for a while, is if you remember the 2009 uprising in Iran, the so-called Green Revolution,
yes,
when not just students but everyday citizens took to the streets against the mullah regime, and there were mass protests against it, and they cracked down very hard. They brought in thugs from the countryside to come in and beat people up. I think they're called the Basenji or Basin, something like that. There's a term for them. These essentially
the religious enforcers.
Exactly, and they brought them in to beat up the students and to imprison them and to execute them. And Obama was silent. And I remember writing a post about why is this guy silent. And when he finally spoke after about a month, literally a month of this going on, he really was very accommodating to the regime. One thing that is very clear from the Obama administration policy in Iran is that keeping the mullahs in power is the goal of the U.S. government. Now, that's very different. You know, regime change doesn't mean we have to invade them, nor should we. Regime change doesn't mean we have to try to topple them, but regime change means that we are not going to accept the mullahs as the perpetual or entitled rulers of Iran. There is no free vote there. There is a vote, but they decide, the Iranian Mullah Council decides who gets to run. So only their candidates get to run. And so why should we accept this regime which calls us the Great Satan, which has killed thousands of Americans, which aids our enemies, which is taking over much of the Middle East through their proxies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, now Assad in Syria, and the Houthi in Yemen? Why should our policy be to try to keep them in power? Why shouldn't our policy be that we don't recognize them? It doesn't mean we're going to invade them or go to war, but we do not accept that the mullahs get everlasting power to rule over the people in Iran without any democratic mechanism. But the Obama administration wants, for whatever its reason, that regime in power and has done everything it can to keep that regime in power.
What a great guest we have in Craig's Lawyers Lounge. His name is William A. Jacobson. When we come back, we're going to return to 2009, not only the disappointment of President Obama not responding to the Green Revolution in Iran, but it was in 2009 when he went on the apology tour and he lost a lot of people like me because I could see this president was not the guy I hoped he was going to be. William A. Jacobson wrote an amazing column back then called Passover is No Time to Wish for the End of Christian America. He has written another column this week about the Pew poll, about Christianity on the wane and what that means for America. William A. Jacobson, when we come back.
News Talk 710 KNUS.
Oh, what a smart guy we have in Craig's Lawyers Lounge. He's a professor at Cornell. He went to Harvard Law School. He was an outstanding litigator in the securities field. His name is William A. Jacobson, and he's written some profound things that relate to this Pew poll, and he's been writing about it for years. But before we go there, Professor Jacobson, you were a big-time litigator in securities law. I imagine you were quite successful, but you made the choice to get out of it and into academia and publishing your blog, Legal Insurrection. What was behind that move?
Well, actually, that was not a move of choice. I have mentioned this on the website, but most people don't know it. I actually came down with serious health problems and had to abandon my law practice. And when I was ready to get back into the workforce after a year and a half, this position became available at Cornell. And so I threw in a resume, and that's how I got there. So I'm a law professor by default, I guess, or by whatever it is, by accident. But it's worked out pretty well. Of course, I wasn't political at that time at all. So who knows whether I would have been hired if I had the persona I have now.
Well, I'm still a litigator, and there's some brain damage involved in that. What did you think of the American system of litigation? Did you find it rewarding, or was it a little brain damaging for you? What do you think is the current health of civil litigation in America?
Well, I guess the way I would probably put it is it's horrible, except that it beats most of the alternatives. I'm not really sure. I mean, it's abusive. There's a lot of abuse in the system. It definitely favors the person with the greater resources, although I was actually a plaintiff's contingency fee lawyer, so that was helped level the field. But, there's just so much of it which is just jockeying for position and not really trying to get to a reasonable result. But I don't really know what the alternative is. I mean, I think it's really important that we preserve our citizens' ability to go to court. Although a lot of what I did was in arbitration, I think people should have that choice. They shouldn't be forced into arbitration. I think, the constitutional rights that we have, to get them enforced, you need access to the judiciary. Unfortunately, there's a lot of abusive litigation, and one of the biggest myths out there, because I was involved in business litigation mostly, one of the biggest myths out there is that the worst abuses are from the plaintiff's lawyers, and there are abuses by the plaintiff's lawyers, or the little people suing over nothing. In fact, the most litigious, most frivolously litigious people I've ever met in my life is the business community. I mean, they use litigation as a strategic tool to advance their business interests. As long as it's ethical, you're allowed to do that. But this notion that the problem in the system are little people with contingency fee lawyers suing too much, that may be a problem, but that's not, I think, the biggest problem. The biggest problem is all this corporate litigation and all this, whether it's patent enforcement on shaky grounds, or copyright claims on shaky grounds, or whatever it happens to be. It's the use of the litigation system as a tool to advance the business. That's my perspective.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, but I'm thinking more from the personal lawyer perspective, and you're training prospective lawyers there at Cornell. The work-life balance, it's hard to maintain, and sometimes I think the most busy lawyers are the least knowledgeable about what's going on in the world because they're so caught up in billable hours and winning their litigation that they kind of ignore what's going on in the world around them.
Yeah, I think it's a very, people say, well, do you miss those days? Well, the thing I miss are the victories. When you win a case, there's few greater feelings than winning a case. But you know what? It's completely exhausting. It's completely all-consuming if you're going to be successful. And there is a detachment from the reality of life. And when I left, I started off in a big law firm in New York City, and I left it after a couple of years because I realized that a lot of what they were doing was just for the sake of billing time. And that, if I had to be in on a Sunday to work because I had work to do, I was certainly willing to do that. But I wasn't going to be in on a Sunday, as many lawyers were, just so they could be seen as being in on a Sunday. So that really was of no interest to me. And most of my career before joining Cornell was in the small firms, and for a while solo. And so I never really appreciated that big law firm culture, but the issue of being a litigator is it can be extremely exhausting, and you wake up 20 years later and you realize, where did life go? And I think that's a problem, not just with law, but with a lot of areas, but I think lawyers feel it a lot also.
No, I think that's profound, and thank goodness that you've taken the time to notice the world around you. In 2009, you wrote an epic column called Passover is No Time to Wish for the End of Christian America. We've already described some of the events that occurred right when Barack Obama became president. He went on his apology tour. We've talked about the Green Revolution in Iran. But there was a cover of Newsweek that really sparked your interest in this column. Tell everybody what that column was about. Passover's No Time to Wish for the End of Christian America.
Yeah, that's one. That was about 6 months into my public writing. I started the website in October 2008, so that was the spring of 2009. And one of the things that's been a topic of mine really almost since day one is what I consider the gratuitous Christian bashing in the media and in academia. And I can say that very freely because I'm not Christian. Nobody can accuse me of having a vested interest. I'm Jewish. But I see what's going on. And it's something that's been going on for a long time. And I just felt that a lot of the bashing, a lot of the mocking, a lot of the other things really ignore the fact that, at least for the Jewish people, the American Christian community has really been one of the best things that ever happened to us. I mean, you go all the way back to the time of Washington's letter to the Toro Synagogue, in the early days of the Republic, guaranteeing the Jewish community there, Toro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, guaranteeing the community their safety and welcoming. And, the United States, not to say that there haven't been problems, there certainly have been problems, but the United States, really, Christian community, more than any other community in the world, has welcomed the Jewish community, has protected the Jewish community, and continues to do so to this day with regard to Israel. I mean, there's no better friend that the Israelis have, the Jewish Israelis have, than the American Christian community. And so all these people, many of whom are liberal Jews, who are constantly bashing Christianity, constantly mocking it on TV and in the movies and elsewhere, and in the political system, they don't realize that, don't wish too hard for something, because, particularly when it comes to Israel, who is Israel going to turn to other than, American Christians, essentially, in a world which is hostile to it? It's surrounded by a sea of people who want to destroy it. The Europeans are completely feckless and weak nowadays. They have no interest, the Europeans, in preserving Western civilization. And who else is there in the world that we can turn to other than American Christians? And that's why I said at Passover, the line in the Haggadah about in every generation they rise up to destroy us, we're in another one of those generations now. And at least in this world, forget, the almighty or religious reasons, but at least in this world, the Israelis, the Jews in Israel, have really one friend in the world, and it's American Christians.
I could not agree more. William A. Jacobson, our special guest in Craig's Lawyers Lounge. He's a law professor at Cornell, very bright. His blog, legalinsurrection.com. This Pew Research poll that talked about an 8% decline between 2007 and 2014 in terms of Americans who identify as Christians. Do you accept the poll, and what do you think are the consequences of that?
Well, I'm not a professional pollster. It seems reasonable. It seems logical. The results were not shocking to me when I saw them. It seems consistent that, in the culture there is an increasing secularization, many times being an enforced secularization. There's a continuing mockery of religion. And when religion is mocked in the U.S., it means it's mocking Christianity. I mean, let's face it. That's what it means. It's, people can say they're mocking all religion, but in fact, they're mostly mocking Christianity. And, decades of erosion or decades of that sort of cultural phenomenon is bound to have an effect. So it doesn't shock me, and I think that it was an 8-point drop in people self-identifying as Christian in that time period. I think it was since 2007, but if you go back a decade earlier, it's been an even bigger slippage. I think it's a slippage more like 15%. So I don't know if it's a valid poll or not, or valid survey, but it seems logical to me that when you have a media culture and an educational culture which is explicitly, in many cases, hostile to Christianity, that will be very embracing, not just tolerant, but very embracing of attacks on Christianity and mockery of Christianity, that there would be a slippage. So is it a good poll? It seems logical to me, and I'm not aware of anything that would make it wrong. And I think what's most important whenever I look at polling, particularly for this sort of polling, is not just this one in isolation, but where you have an organization that repeatedly over the years asks similar questions. You can see trends. And so even if it's off, at least the trends should be valid because the same questions being asked over different periods of time. And so it seems logical to me, and it seems like that's the direction that we're heading.
Right. I recommend your full column. You can catch it at legalinsurrection.com. And you talk about this multi-generational attack on the culture and the education system, on religion in general, but particularly on Christianity. And you write at the end of it, if there's any surprise at all, it's that the decline was not more rapid. It's really accelerated under Barack Obama. He says he's a Christian, but I don't think he's really been good for Christianity in America, do you?
Well, he's been nearly silent about the massive assault on the Christian communities around the Middle East. That, he will get more agitated over a police incident someplace in the U.S., and that's not to say he shouldn't be interested in those things, but he'll get more agitated over a disputed police incident than the mass slaughter of Christians throughout the ethnic cleansing of Christians throughout most of the Middle East. Our administration's close to silent on it. And so, I don't know if he's been good or bad for Christians in the U.S., but he's been silent about really the stress that the Christian communities around the world are under.
As a fellow member of the tribe, it's the scariest thing that I've seen in modern times, because I always thought that if Christians suffered the persecution that Jews have historically suffered, that the Christians in their massive numbers and the power that they hold would rise up and say, no way, we're not going to put up with this. But I'm shocked that there aren't rallies to support the Christians who are suffering in the Middle East. For example, the Ethiopians who were told one line for Muslims, one line for Christians, and the Christians got marched to the Mediterranean and slaughtered. I would expect the White House and for the people of America and around the world to rally in support of these fellow followers of Christ, but it just hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't, and it's truly baffling because this is not a president who hesitates to express an opinion. He's got an opinion about just about everything other than the plight of Christians in the Middle East. And it's just very, very strange to me looking at it. And it's very worrisome to me because, we often talk about, canaries in the coal mine, et cetera. I mean, what's happening to the Christian communities throughout the Middle East really is a canary in the coal mine for the way the world is going and the way, Western civilization is going. And he seems to care not about it. He's much more concerned about a particular incident. If you remember when the Professor Gates was arrested outside his home in Cambridge, Barack Obama was very quick to chime in on that, very quick to hold a beer summit at the White House.
Right. But Trayvon Martin could have been his son. Yeah, Ferguson.
Yeah, Trayvon Martin's case I followed very closely. We covered the trial every single day on my website. Mm-hmm. And, whether you like George Zimmerman or not, he wasn't guilty of what he was charged with.
No, and not once it was established that he was the voice screaming in terror. It was a ridiculous case, and Now George Silverman is the victim of an attempted murder. And who gets everybody whipped up? It's this administration. I don't like it. I don't care for it a bit. But you work with young people. Give us some hope for the future, William Jacobson, before we end this interview.
Well, I interact, obviously, with a lot of students. But one thing I don't do is I don't talk politics in the classroom. I'm not going to be one of those professors who tries to shove my viewpoint onto students. So literally, it never comes up in my classroom. But I do interact with a lot of students on campus, particularly conservative students. I'm the faculty advisor for the Cornell Review, which is the undergraduate student conservative newspaper. It's really a phenomenal newspaper. And several people, students over the years from the Cornell Review, have interned at my website and written for us, some quite extensively, and gone on to great things. And when I meet those students, I really do get a bit of hope, because you have students who are willing to put themselves out there, who are willing to buck the trends, who are willing to be free thinkers and to express their viewpoints. And like I said when we were talking about Ted Cruz, they have to be better than everybody else because they're in a hostile environment. And really, when I meet those students and I see what they're doing, when I speak to or interact with pro-Israel students on campus who, again, on some campuses are dealing in hostile environments, but have the courage to stand up for what they believe in that hostile environment, it does give me hope. That's not to say that we don't need changes in our educational system. I think parents and alumni need to get more involved, but we tend to focus on the bad that's going on, but there is a lot of good, and there are a lot of great students out there who do give me hope.
Well, I hope to stay in touch. I will by reading your blog, legalinsurrection.com. Professor Jacobson, thank you so much for sharing part of your Saturday with us.
Great. Thank you for having me on.
Wow. What an exciting